All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, Section 2, Congress and the Remaking of the South. So let us recall that the differing views on Reconstruction pretty much lie in the president, who is Andrew Johnson at the time. Andrew Johnson. And Congress, on the other hand, right? And this really is kind of the battleground, the political battleground of Reconstruction. Congress is made up mostly of those radical Republicans. And under Johnson's Reconstruction, there were lots of former Confederates being admitted to the Union. This was seen as unacceptable to Congress, and they're going to take action. One way that Congress took action was by passing the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is a bureau. We'll just say, and we'll call it an institution. Oops. An institution designed to assist former slaves, right? So there are many enslaved people in the South who now find themselves emancipated, have really only the clothes on their back. And that transition into emancipation could be very difficult. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was designed in order to assist those people, providing immediate assistance like food and shelter, but also providing kind of more long-term assistance in the form of things like job training and education. Really, where the Freedmen's Bureau succeeded was in establishing public schools. Recall that in pretty much most former Confederate states, it was illegal for enslaved people to read and write, and illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. So public schools in the South, which there were already not very many public schools in the South before the Civil War to begin with, for whites as well. But many public schools were built in the South. We'll say public schools in the South, we'll say helped reduce illiteracy. And, within a few generations, the literacy rate in the South increases significantly. So the Freedmen's Bureau was, a government action, and there were a lot of people from the North, specifically teachers, men and women in this case, that moved to the South to assist in, the creation of public schools and other sort of institutions that can help former enslaved people. But there were also other organizations that were non-governmental. One example was the American Missionary Association, a Christian organization that also helped former enslaved people. And this was one way that popular action could take place after the Civil War, right? Many people moving into some of these former Confederate states and assisting with that transition. However, the political battle continued. The Freedmen's Bureau initially was on slate to expire after 1 year. Congress wanted to renew the Bureau's charter, and that was responded to by the president with a veto. So once again, we have the president, in this case, who vetoed the rechartering of the Freedmen's Bureau, versus Congress, on the other hand, which wants to continue the work that the Freedmen's Bureau has essentially been doing. And that battle will continue throughout Reconstruction between President Johnson and the Congress. So on one level, there's sort of the political battle taking place. And in some respects, Northerners are not satisfied on that level because you have former Confederate leaders re-entering into the Union. On another level, you have Reconstruction on the ground. That is, what is going on in those former Confederate states as they're being readmitted to the Union. And in those former Confederate states, with the abolition of slavery, with the 13th Amendment, comes the Black Codes. Now, the Black Codes are a series of state laws. Again, this is on a state-by-state basis, so they're a little bit different depending on what what state you're talking about, but a series of state laws that seek to legislate, we'll say series of state laws that seek to legislate we'll call it the black-white, we'll just say relationship. So these black codes have sort of two different elements to it. You can see it as kind of one and the same. But on the one hand, there is the economic problem of the South. And that is, with emancipation, there are no workers to provide, or no slaves to work on former cotton plantations. And so one thing that planters need is, someone to perform that labor. And so what the black codes do is they create a set of laws that require specifically black Americans to be signed to a labor contract. So we might just say of labor contracts, we'll say that the black codes required black Americans to be signed to a labor contract. And the punishment for not being signed to a labor contract would essentially be physical labor. So it was, a catch-22 in many sorts. And these laws were passed in order to solve, you might say, the economic problem of the South now that slavery is abolished. You could see that in many ways. This is pretty much, it's not exactly the same, but, it's sort of a neo-slavery. It's slavery by another name. It performs pretty much the same function than it did before. And again, this is happening on a state-by-state basis. So the black codes create sort of this system of a new slavery in the South, whereby black Americans are required to be signed to labor contracts. If they're not, they're arrested and then forced to perform labor anyways. On the other hand, the black codes are also meant to create or legislate a sort of social and cultural system, and that is of white supremacy. And what the black codes do is they create two different law codes. One set of laws for whites to follow, one set of laws for blacks to follow. So we might say that laws discriminated against blacks in the South. And so again, there was a little bit of difference depending on what state we're talking about, but there are, some similarities. For example, every single former Confederate state denied black men the right to vote, whereas white men did have the right to vote. Other laws also prohibited, the ownership of certain property, being able to serve in juries, being able to testify in court, right? So essentially, here's a law that whites follow, here's a law that blacks follow. And this was meant to uphold the social and cultural system of white supremacy in the South. Now, Northerners in Congress, looking at the black codes happening on the ground, looking at former Confederates rejoining in the U.S. government, say, something has to be done. And so they act with the Civil Rights Act, right? Again, when we think about Congress, what does Congress do? Well, Congress passes laws, right? That's really one of the only tools that Congress has. So they passed the Civil Rights Act, right, as a law. The Civil Rights Act essentially overturns the Dred Scott decision, right? So we might say overturned by Civil Rights Act. And I want to say this is 1866. I want to say that date may be a little bit off. But essentially it makes African Americans citizens, what the Civil Rights Act does. And being citizens means that, African Americans, former slaves, blacks in the South, are entitled to all the same rights as their white counterparts. So, and essentially, what this seeks to do, right, this law, is to overturn the black codes, right, to say that this is not acceptable. President Johnson, as we know, we may be able to guess what his reaction is going to be. He vetoes that Civil Rights Act. However, and this is written into the Constitution as a part of the checks and balances, if Congress has 2/3, I believe 2/3, of members who approve a law after the presidential override, it still becomes a law. And with that, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed. The black codes were overturned as a result of that, right? However, we do have to question, and this is the true with, this is true with all sort of laws. What's enforcement going to look like, right? A law is really only words on paper until it's enforced. Congress, knowing really what battle lies ahead of them, wants to make this change even more concrete. And, what's more concrete than a law? Well, it's an amendment, right? And so the second Reconstruction Amendment begins to be drafted by Congress, again, with the idea of overturning the black codes in mind. The 14th Amendment really explicitly states two very important things. One is birthright citizenship. It says that if somebody is born in the U.S., that makes you a citizen, right? It doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black, whatever it is, right? You are guaranteed to those rights. And it states that there's equal protection under the law, right? And in many ways, this overrules the black codes, but really has, in pretty much in American history, any single law that relates to discrimination can, in some sense, be cited back to the 14th Amendment, stating that everybody has to be subject to the same law. The 14th Amendment was made a requirement, we might say made a requirement by Congress. Now, here's maybe one of the issues, and that is the amendment process requires 2/3 of Congress to vote yes on it. Well, we know that Congress will probably pass it because there are enough people in Congress from the North that agree with it. But then it requires 3/4 of the states. And President Johnson, in response to the 14th Amendment, actually goes on a public tour encouraging states to reject it, right? And so the status of the 14th Amendment will ultimately lie on what the states decide to do with it. Northern states probably, good to go ahead and vote yes on it. But Congress is going to have to find some sort of way to make those former Confederate states get on board with the 14th Amendment and make that, make it a reality.